Welcome to the Journal podcast from the Chartered Insurance Institute, a place for thought-provoking discussion from the world of insurance and beyond. I'm Matt Connell, Policy and Public Affairs Director at the Chartered Insurance Institute. In this episode of the Journal podcast, we're focusing on a recent CII consultation. This was set up to gather views on the roles insurers can play in improved road safety for young drivers, following a report from the Coroner's Office of Coventry and Warwickshire into the tragic deaths of Harry Purcell and Matilda Seccombe, who were killed in a road traffic collision involving a 17-year-old driver who was later convicted of causing death by careless driving. We'll also be discussing risk modelling with younger drivers, the role insurers can and do play in improving road safety, and education for young drivers. Finally, we'll also be looking at the impact on the insurance profession of all these issues over the next 5 to 10 years. Joining me on the podcast today is Adam Harper, Executive Director of Strategy, Advocacy and Professional Standards at the CII Group, Thomas Clarke, Motor Strategy Director, and Warren Carley, Vertical Principal, both from Lexis Nexis Risk Solutions. Thank you for speaking with us on the podcast today. To kick things off, perhaps I can go to you, Adam, first. Could you explain what this Chartered Insurance Institute consultation on young drivers is and what prompted it?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you've already mentioned, the consultation was prompted by us having received Prevention of Future Deaths report from the Coroner's Office of Coventry and Warwickshire. So the Coroner's Office wrote directly to the CII along with the FCA and the ABI and asking us to consider how the insurance profession could help improve road safety for young drivers, and I think particularly around the way that telematics is used and explained. So the consultation effectively represents our opportunity to gather views from members and from public interest groups that would enable us to better understand current practice and to help us identify what more the profession can do to support safer driving.
That's great. Thanks, Adam. And what's the consultation aiming to achieve for younger drivers in the insurance profession?
I think ostensibly what we're seeking to achieve through the consultation is pretty much aiming to understand the role that insurers can play in improving road safety, not only in pricing risk, but also in helping to reduce it. For young drivers, what that means is looking at whether products such as telematics are explained sufficiently clearly, and indeed whether they provide feedback that helps people become safer and more confident behind the wheel. And I think for the profession, it's about enabling us to identify good practice, encouraging high standards, and also making sure that the use of data and technology supports customers in a fair way, in a transparent way, and in a responsible way.
Brilliant. And if I can widen it out to all three of you, in terms of measurement, what one thing would you fix on as maybe a measurement of success from a consultation or a process like this? Perhaps I can open it up and ask you, Tom, first.
Yeah, sure. So I know you've asked for one thing, so I'll give you two things, just to be awkward. I think safer young drivers is the first one. So from a safety perspective, success means telematics being used not just as a pricing tool, but also as a behavioural intervention. So how can you gamify it? How can you help young drivers to understand their own risk, where their risk points are, but also use peer pressure positively so they're competing with each other to be safer, not to be the fastest. I think there's a real benefit that we can drive there from that safer young driver perspective by using the data and gamifying it to really speak to these drivers. But also from an industry point of view, it's about having more consistent insurers in the market. So greater consistency around how telematics is applied. At the moment, it's obviously everyone has their own slight this nuance within telematics. We talk about telematics as a very broad topic, really, across the market, between people using black boxes to everyday plugins to apps, but actually having something that is more standardized. So we've got clearer standards around how telematics data is used, how the safety benefits are communicated, and how sort of young drivers and parents are supported at the point of purchase, I think is where the profession can really move from just simply pricing the risk to actively reducing it.
Absolutely. So there's elements there of kind of making it relevant as well as coming out. You can't just force out the final outcome. Warren, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, definitely. I concur with what Tom has just mentioned. I'd add a couple of things to that. So Tom is absolutely spot on the peer pressure that people often feel as young drivers, and finding a way to gamify that so that they're working together to improve their driving rather than sort of see who can go the fastest or brake the hardest. That's an imperative. But I would extend it and say, although this is focused very much on young drivers and the risks that they're facing, we also have an opportunity now with connected vehicle data to extend that. And so why are we focusing only on young drivers when actually with almost all vehicles very soon going to be able to produce the sort of data that can be scored, then offering telematics to all drivers. And then the safety starts at the family level, rather than just saying to the young driver, here's your first vehicle, you have to have a black box and you're going to be monitored everywhere you go. It becomes, some of their habits will have been learned through how parents drive and the vehicles that they've sat in as children. And so we have the opportunity now to extend that and say, yes, we need to reduce the number of accidents that are on the road. That's imperative. But everybody's behavior can change. Everybody's behavior can be helped.
Absolutely, yeah. No, so it's not just about the focus on the highest risk group. That often happens, doesn't it? The older generations tend to get let off and get to behave how they like, but we focus on the younger generations. It's things with smoking and things like that. And there's got to come a point where different generations have to set an example as well. Adam, can I just come back to you then in terms of what you've said about why the CII came about to launch this conversation, and based on Warren's and Tom's remarks, any thoughts on you on what would really crystallise the success or otherwise of this consultation?
Yeah, I think Warren makes some really interesting points, and I guess to that extent, ideally, what we would hope would come out from the consultation is that it would help to shift telematics from being seen as something that's actually restrictive or punitive to something that genuinely supports a recognised sort of acceptance of how it underpins safer driving. And I think in that respect, there's potentially an opportunity for us to sort of identify how we can go about ensuring that the telematics products are being communicated much more consistently and much more transparently with customers. And by customers, I think that talks to the wider family as well as the younger drivers, genuinely understanding what is being measured and how it affects them, and therefore how they can learn from that and improve their safer driving. So ultimately, in safety terms, it would mean that all recipients of that feedback are getting useful feedback, they're getting encouragement and support that enables them to potentially identify any risky habits before they then lead to more serious consequences. So that kind of clearer shared view of what good practice looks like, I think will be a fantastic outcome of the consultation process.
Brilliant. So, one of those, I mean, we've already talked quite a lot about telematics. I wonder if this is a good point to just dive in a bit deeper and perhaps explain how it works and how it can be used effectively, or what kind of insight it produces and how that insight can help drivers improve their driving and make drivers safer. Tom, perhaps you could kick us off on that one, just a little bit more about how telematics works.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so with the telematics data, you're generating individual behavior data. So your speed, the braking, acceleration, time of day. I've even seen some where it'll look at when you're doing your regular commute, are you driving into the sun or not? You can get really granular with some of this data. But broadly speaking, if we think about it in terms of braking, speeding, acceleration, cornering, all those sorts of things. So we begin to get a view of how that individual drives. We can then model that at the person level. So, normally when we're talking about standard insurance policy, we're looking at the cohort. We're looking at someone that looks like Tom, for a Tom-shaped model, and therefore my risk is based off the Tom-shaped model. Whereas with telematics, we don't look off at the Tom-shaped model, we look at Tom, right? And so we know exactly how I drive. I take corners too fast. Maybe I'm running over the speed limit. Or the reverse could be true. Maybe I'm a very safe driver, but we have the benefit of that insight from the data that's streaming off there. Because, we know these all play a huge part. If I'm regularly driving in sub the daylight, is very different risk than if I drive a lot at 1 a.m. at night. And so all of these factors can get taken into account. And that's what telematics fundamentally gives us from that perspective.
Fantastic. And then having established that, Warren, I wonder if we could come back to you. And we already heard from you about how, young drivers can easily be identified as the problem, but in fact, driving habits are learned one from the other. So what does telematics tell us both about young drivers and about older drivers?
Behavior. So Tom touched on that quite well. The behavior of a driver, again, inherently learned, and then the younger you are, the less experience you'll have. But it's also interesting, and one point Tom did make, he mentioned the time of day. And one of the things that often comes up in a score is like, well, I feel as if I'm being penalized for driving at night, but I'm a good driver. And the answer is, well, you're not being penalized. If we were to stop and take a step back and say, well, what is this score? And what is this score trying to do? And so actually, for the insurer, it is identifying risk. But we can flip that. And we can say for the user, for the driver, it's identifying your safety. How safe are you? The greater the risk, the less safe you are. So the lower the risk, the safer you are. Unfortunately, when we come to driving at night, you may not be the risk. You could be the safest driver in the world, but at 1 o'clock in the morning, there may be some very unsafe drivers. So therefore, driving at night doesn't mean you are a bad driver. It means the risk you are putting yourself, your passengers, and potentially other people on the road in is increased. And that's what the insurers need to know. Some people will never be able to stop driving late at night. It's their job, but that doesn't change the risk.
So perhaps some of the headlines that sort of make us think of young drivers wanting to prove themselves and things like that, it's all a bit of a crude oversimplification. It's actually some other lifestyle elements that mean that they're at more risk because they're in an environment where there is more risks.
Yeah, I mean, I think to say it's an oversimplification would be a very broad brush, because I think there is almost definitely data to say, yes, this area of the market, this niche of young high-risk drivers, at the same time, they're also quite nervous. So it's that balance. It's identifying the behavior and then educating the feedback and what the labels that we apply to this, and the safety rather than being monitored, the benefits rather than the punitive action.
I think that's a really important point, Warren. I've got a 17-year-old son who's learning to drive at the moment, and I can see that there are instances when his confidence levels are high and he feels that he's doing well and that kind of comes across. But then similarly, that can very quickly change, that level of nervousness. But I was really taken by what you said there too about how this is positioned, because I think ultimately, if you've got on that level of trust amongst young drivers, and that driven by their genuine level of understanding as to what is being measured, why it's being measured, it's repositioning in their mind that telematics is there to help them. It's not there as a punitive measure and monitoring them. And I think that shift in emphasis, and I think too, the way in which that's communicated with the parents is an important part of kind of like enabling a different mindset and a different approach to telematics and the way in which it works. I mean, I think fundamentally what you have is a situation that with those of us who've been driving for a lot longer, there is a greater level of data, I guess, in ways in terms of instances that we have or haven't incurred. But young drivers, that individual history is going to be limited. They've only just started out on that process. So it becomes all the more important to utilize technology like this to get a richer picture and enable them to understand why that is. I think is going to be vital.
An analogy I often like to use is people say, oh, it's like Big Brother, you're going to watch everything. And I'll often say, yeah, but it's not Big Brother with a capital B. We're not the all-seeing state that's trying to monitor everything you do. We're the big brother with the little b. We're your big brother that wants to put an arm around you and make sure you're safer. And repositioning it like that, I think, is what really needs to happen for everyone.
That is really fascinating. I guess coming back to you, Adam, what do you think that insurers could do more than they already do, as well as the wider insurance profession, to improve awareness and transparency and ultimately trust in the way telematics works?
I think one step that would be really important to building trust is about improving the language and the way things are framed, as we were just talking about, shifting that emphasis away from it being seen as something that's punitive and genuinely being positioned as something that's adding value and providing support. We're referencing, I think, within the consultation that the suggestion that telematics, should be presented as something which can support across a longer period of time, not something which is positioned as something that supports from a probationary period. And I think aligned to that could be a case of insurers moving from, utilizing wording like, we are monitoring to it enables you to demonstrate. And I think it then kind of makes it more about the insurers being in information receiving mode rather than that monitoring perspective. And I think that kind of shift matters because it's about giving young drivers more of a sense of agency. And another dimension that would really help to establish that would be insurers being clearer about, what data is being collected, what that data is going to be used for. And I guess to some extent, positioning mechanisms that enable drivers to understand how they can improve their score. But at the heart of it, more consistent communication, not just with the younger drivers, but with the families will really help. Particularly mindful of the role that sort of parents are going to play in supporting new drivers. So I think it is that thing about language and framing really, which would be an important step.
Sorry, jump in there. And I think like a really good point there around showing drivers how to improve their score, because that's how we go about improving road safety overall. If we just use it as a stick, so to speak, in a carrot, that's one thing. Having the feedback loop is really, really important. So it's not just about pricing. It's really then giving the driver the visibility of their own behavior and then how to change. So where we can have sort of tailored coaching insights being like delivered directly to the driver, that can really empower them to like adjust their cornering or their speed or whatever the things they need to do. I think that's really powerful. And particularly when you consider insurers have a really unique position in this ecosystem because they have a direct financial relationship with the driver in a way that others don't. So, when a premium is going up or down based on how someone's driving, that's a real incentive or disincentive that doesn't matter how many driving lessons or highway code tests or classroom sessions, you can't replicate that. But actually having that kind of financial component is a real driver for change, I think.
You picked up on coaching. It's one of the things that within the consultation we point to is there's sort of evidence that if you have parental monitoring or as part of that feedback loop that parents get cited on that feedback, then that supports the role that they play in terms of that coaching dynamic. And I guess if you kind of support that as part of that feedback loop with targeted messages that help to encourage the safer behavior that's being seen and it's being captured through the telematics thing, that would be a really powerful message, wouldn't it? It's something that kind of makes it feel much more engaging and much more taking into account the kind of collective role, not just of the driver, but also of their family to support.
Yeah, agreed. I think when you look at some of the data, you can see, obviously, we talk about young drivers being high risk, but if you look at between 2004 and 22, casualties involving at least one young driver has fallen by about 60%. Now we compare that across all drivers, and that reduction has been 38%. So, young driver safety has materially improved more than the average over that time. And I think, behavioral feedback and telematics is a material part of that story, but it's that constant improvement and how we can continue that development journey.
That's really interesting. And I think that's actually quite a powerful dimension to it. If you can kind of correlate between the way in which telematics are being used and that higher than average, improvement, I think that in and of itself is something which would probably feature quite nicely as part of establishing that trust that I was talking about earlier.
And again, concur completely with what Thomas said, with over half of drivers with worse driver behavior scores tend to see improvements. That's a statistic. But where I also feel we have an opportunity is we tend to focus very much on the insurer and the driver. But there is a third party in here, and that is the auto manufacturer, because it is their vehicle that the driver is in, and they're often sort of left out. No auto manufacturer ever wants to be considered as their car's not fit for, shouldn't be used by a young person. We need to bring them into this conversation. Where does that feedback fit? That today, the burden of that feedback is being placed onto the insurer. In my point of view, it is a shared thing. There is as much of a relationship between the auto manufacturer and the driver as there is between the driver and the insurer. And bringing those three parts of the puzzle together you will deliver a far more joined up message across the vehicle, the driver, and the insurance policy. The three things need to work together.
Fantastic insight. And I guess going on from there, I'm sort of looking forward over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, as self-driving elements become introduced to cars, but cars don't necessarily become completely self-driving. I guess sticking with you, Warren, how do you think that's going to develop, that kind of relationship, and where will telematics and education and all that sort of tripartite relationship, where do you see all that developing?
That's almost a futurist question, isn't it? Because there are many elements to that. I'm also going to call on Tom to answer some of this as well. We're going to see a lot more focus on who is responsible for when an accident happens in an autonomous vehicle. Who made that decision? Was it the software that made that decision? If the car is driving itself, then what is the driver? There is no driver. The driver is a passenger. Therefore, who is responsible? I think the questions around this are going to be focused on how we approach where autonomous vehicles appear within our urban lifestyle. Waymo are already close to starting in London. And if everybody's using Waymo, who's using their own vehicle? So where does the insurance sit? We might actually see a paradigm shift in the way that insurance is managed and sold within the urban environment. And that could be very, very different to outside of that high built-up urban environment where Waymo vehicles become the standard thing, or autonomous taxis become the standard thing. How does it work in the rural areas? So I think that there are many other factors that will come into where the future will go with telematics or insurance, personal lines insurance for auto in the future.
Just to add to what Warren said there, I agree. I think we should think about autonomy as two separate strands. So we have robotaxis. So as Warren said, we have Waymo, we have Wake, both testing right now. You'll be able to get a robotaxi in London this year. But that is something you'll be able to do and experience an autonomous vehicle. And so we will see that in most of the major cities. The other strand to think about in autonomy is going to be in the consumer vehicle and your personalized vehicle, right? In terms of you have a car where it could be driving itself or the driver could be driving. That will take slightly longer to come on stream, although we have some manufacturers selling things called full self-drive. It is not full self-drive. The car is not being driven by the car. It's you driving it. But that will start to come on stream. We look to how the future of kind of autonomy will go. China is sort of dictating the way. China is by far and away ahead on all metrics when it comes to automotive. And the latest thinking there is by 2030, so only 4 years away, about a fifth of new cars sold in China will have some degree of autonomy, right? Some functionality. Maybe it's only on motorways, maybe it's in urban environments. That will come down the track to the UK and Europe. And so the other interesting point we get there is when you have autonomy, you have radar, LiDAR, vision cameras, ultrasonic sensors that are all generating data. And when we think about telematics in this context of connected car, having that additional vehicle data, as well as the behavioral data we've talked about already, telematics, could be really powerful for insurers if we can figure out how that data can be shared in a way that kind of works for everyone in the ecosystem. So I think, when we think about autonomy, we should also think about what the data autonomy generates and how in a telematics world, that could be leveraged going forward as well.
Fantastic. And as we all know, some people are better with technology than others. So how do you think that's going to develop? I guess at the moment, there's some people who are a lot more familiar with telematics than others. And, just in the course of some of our work, we've heard people say how telematics can be quite clunky and difficult to use for both parents and younger drivers. So what's your feeling, Tom, based on what you're seeing on how well people understand telematics at the moment? And is there a generational difference? And what does that mean for all of this?
I think it's getting easier. I think we're seeing now more telematics in terms of connected car and in terms of smartphone apps. It's less the black box. It's less the OBD plugin. I remember some insurers would send an OBD plugin out in the post and then they just scramble around her and plug the thing in and make sure it's working and is it connected? Like all that's starting to go away because we're either using the smartphone that 95% 5% of the country is using. It's very familiar with downloading and installing an app, connecting it to your insurance. It's fairly straightforward. Or equally, with the connected car and the ability to connect the car and the data that comes off there. So I think the barrier to call it technology in terms of the educational piece is continuing to diminish because we have new ways of doing telematics that mean it's actually much easier for people now than it was maybe a decade ago.
If I can take on from what Connor said, there is no industry standard to the data that a connected car will produce at the moment. And so one of the reasons black boxes were so ubiquitous is because you knew you'd get sort of the same data out of your black box. If you ran a program, you put a black box in every vehicle. Although you had to front the cost, the running of that program, you had a standardized data set coming back. So I think one of the questions we will all have to address is, what is the lowest common denominator that gives us the most value from all of the connected data that we have? It needs to be normalized across the industry so that everybody benefits. So the car manufacturers aren't suddenly faced with a situation where they've got to put very expensive equipment in to monitor the people that need to be monitored. And at the same time, where does that app sit? So I mentioned earlier on, you have the OEM's companion app. Most modern vehicles, they have an app. You can unlock the doors, you can turn the heating on, it's got information for you. Why would the insurer need to build an app to do this when the user then has a companion app and they have the insurer's app? Well, I drive my car every day, so I'm going to use the companion app almost every day. I don't necessarily need to check my insurer's app every day. And I can't strengthen enough what I'm trying to move towards here, and that is we need to bring the parties together. The sum of the whole is far greater when the entire value chain works together.
And then do you think that can happen voluntarily, or is that something that would need a sort of sector-wide agreement? Or
I think the car manufacturers are moving into this app technology, whereas 20 years ago, it's like they build vehicles and they make sure those vehicles are safe and economical and effective. But now there is an entire data generation that is evolving within the OEMs, the auto OEMs, that they absolutely need. It's imperative for them to be there. Whereas insurers have always looked at data, numbers that they crunch to evaluate what their risk is, or other data that they could collect on their market. Bringing those data sets together and normalizing those data sets into something that is beneficial for the market, improves safety, reduces accidents, but actually provides everybody with education. It'll provide the OEMs with education. It'll provide their drivers with education. And it'll provide the insurers with education. That has to be a benefit.
Fantastic. I mean, we've heard so many insights today, and there'll be people listening here with lots of different expertise and experience of their own. The consultation, by the way, goes on till the 7th of August, so there's still time to contribute. I wanted to finish just by asking each of you, for people listening who might be thinking, this is all very interesting, but where do my views fit in? Where does my perspective fit in? Perhaps starting with you, Adam, what kind of input would you be interested in hearing from CII members and beyond to inform this consultation and to deliver the kind of success criteria that we were talking about at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, when we were reflecting on the success criteria at the beginning, I think I articulated, our aim is to enable the kind of profession itself to reflect on how it can use its expertise and its products. And I think, to some extent, picking up on the point that Warren was making around, standard setting and the way in which that can then play out through, that kind of partnership approach that was just been reflected on. It's all about seeking to kind of support safer choices. And so I think, getting that input from participants to the consultation to enable us to better understand how that can be driven, I think will be really important. Because I think if, as a result of the engagement through the consultation, we can lead to clearer communication, that more integrated and accepted usage of telematics with that sort of stronger focus on prevention, then I think it would be a real win-win for all participants.
Brilliant. And any thoughts from you, Tom, about the kind of contributions that we might get?
I mean, I agree with what Adam said there in terms of, I think, really establishing really clear standards and guidance is crucial. When we think telematics has been going for over 20 years now, when we think about the contributions and what kind of organizations can do, is sharing the learnings they've had over the last 20 years, right? What's worked and what hasn't, because everyone will have different experience and maybe tried things that someone else hasn't tried. It didn't work for whatever reason, or maybe it did. So sharing those learnings that they've had over, the last 20 plus years on the telematics, I think can be really powerful.
And then from your side, Warren?
Absolutely agree with what both Adam and Tom have said. And I would like to take the scope a little bit wider and say, well, we talk about making the road safer, reducing the number of accidents that young people are in, but there are the background costs, which so often don't get talked about. And that is when the accident happens, immediately we say, well, the car needs to be repaired was the personal right. But then you have all of the other costs as well. Let's say that person had to go to hospital. The costs, the processes, the operations behind it, there are benefits across a far bigger value chain to everybody coming together, sharing their data. And the insurance industry rightly will guard some of that. It's like, this is our intellectual property. This is how we price. This is how we maintain market position. And that should never, you should never take that away from somebody. That's what makes a free market great. But at the same time, some of that information would allow us, like I say, come together and say, right, how do we approach this? So that end to end, every person in that value chain, even the ones that we don't often think about, when it's hitting the NHS further on down the line, or the operational procedures that take place that still have to be paid for, they have to be covered by the insurance. Well, what if we brought those people to the party as well? What if we said to them, well, what are you experiencing? And what would your feedback be as well? It might be too early in the consultation for that. I mean,
that's what's come out of this so much, is that this is a society thing, isn't it? I guess you start off by thinking of it, maybe it's a technical thing or a technological thing or a commercial market thing, but quite quickly it kind of mushrooms into something that impacts the whole of society, that has intergenerational perspectives. I guess from Tom is kind of urban versus rural as well, which is a big theme of so many things that are going on at the moment. So it really is a huge issue that needs squaring up. Brilliant. Thanks to you all. Really appreciate that fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Journal Podcast. If you'd like to contribute to the consultation, you can do so through the link provided in the show notes that come with the podcast. You can find other useful links in the show notes and related articles on the Journal website, along with further podcasts, many of which can be logged as CPD directly on the site with one click. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, and subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.